index, or the CPI, which is something most people have heard about. Now, we call the GDP price deflator a deflator rather than an index, because what we're actually doing is deflating nominal GDP by our price index. Right? So that's why we use, plus we like to confuse people by using different terms for exactly the same thing. So GDP deflator would be our broadest measure of inflation in the economy. The personal consumption expenditure deflator and the consumer price index are similar. They're measuring consumer spending, which, again, in the United States is about 70% of the total. There are some technical differences between the PCE deflator and the consumer price index, but these are technical differences that we don't really need to spend any time discussing. So once we have a price index, we can then calculate inflation. And for inflation, we use the lowercase Greek letter pi. So inflation is nothing more than the price index this year minus the price index the prior year divided by the prior year's price index. In other words, it's simply the percentage change in the price index from one year to the next. Here's a chart that shows these three price indexes, the GDP deflator, the PCE deflator, and the consumer price index, year-on-year changes. So this is our measure of inflation over a long period of time. Again, notice they all seem to move together. So when one's going up, pretty much the other one's going up. There are some gaps in places, but the direction of change is the same across all three measures, which makes it easy for us, because what that means then is we don't have to worry about which price index measure we're using. So we will only talk about inflation. I'm not going to say consumer price inflation or GDP deflator inflation, because the price index isn't going to matter. They all move together. Now, let's think about unemployment for a bit. Now, when we talked last time about some of the major features the major focus of macroeconomics, we said employment and unemployment. Well, employment's actually pretty easy to measure, right? Everybody raise their hand if you got a job. You know, ask employers if how many people you have on your payroll. Right? It's pretty easy to find out whether people are working. That's something that everybody kind of identifies with. So we don't have to have an elaborate description of what it means to be employed. However, to be unemployed, we need to have a more substantive definition. To be unemployed means more than just not having a job. It actually means being willing and able to work, actively looking for work, and not currently have a job. So some people might be able and willing to work, not have a job, but also not be actively looking. Full-time students who aren't working might fall into that category. Right? I mean, well, I'm hoping most of you are willing and able to work, right? If need be. Don't have a job, but if you're not actually looking for a job because you're a full-time student, then we would say you're not unemployed. You could also be ill or injured and not be able to work. Even if you were actively looking and didn't have a job, we still would not count you as unemployed because you weren't able to actually work. So we can get lots of different combinations of people who might fall into two of these categories, but not all three of them. Yes? So the question was, are part-time workers who want to work full-time considered to be unemployed? Okay, think about your question. Are part-time workers, they have a job. Right? Maybe not the job they like or want. Maybe they'd like to work more hours, but they still have a job. We make a distinction between do you have a job, do you not have a job. So turns out you're considered to be employed even if you're only working 1 hour a month. A month. Okay, so did you draw a paycheck? Yes? We can only measure, so the question was, what happens if it's a job where you get paid under the table and there's no actual official paycheck? We can only measure what we can measure, right? I'm assuming that an employer that pays you in cash under the table and doesn't have a formal paycheck for you is not going to tell the government, oh, by the way, I have 14 employees and I'm actually only paying 3 of them, right? So, you know, we can only measure what we can measure. If people want to hide information from the government when they collect statistics, our measurements aren't going to be as accurate as they could be. Okay, so one of the things that we do when we measure unemployment is we first have to start with what we call the adult population. Now, the adult population comes about because in the 1930s, the United States adopted child labor laws. And there were all sorts of restrictions on children working. And the definition of an adult in the 1930s was identified to be someone who is 16 years or older. Okay? So for the United States, the definition of an adult is, for labor market purposes, is 16 or over. So we take that group of people. We put them into one of 3 categories. Do you have a job? Yes, you're employed. Do you not have a job? Are you willing and able? Are you actively looking? You're unemployed. Do neither of the first 2 categories count? Yes. Now you're out of the labor force. So retired people, out of the labor force. Stay-at-home spouses would be out of the labor force. Right? They're neither employed nor are they officially unemployed. So that means then we can figure out where everybody in the adult population falls. There is one special category that we have for out of the labor force that we call discouraged workers. Back here, where we talk about actively looking for work, the definition of actively looking in the United States is you have done something proactive in the last 4 weeks. The last 4 weeks. Other countries have longer time periods, but in the U.S., it's 4 weeks. If you have been looking for work, but you had stopped looking in the last 4 weeks, you are no longer considered to be unemployed, officially unemployed. You may still be willing and able. You may still not have a job, but if you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, you now get counted as something that is called a discouraged worker, which, of course, is an oxymoron in this context. It's not the worker that's discouraged. It's the job seeker that's discouraged. Right? This person does not have a job. But if you've looked in the last year, but not the last 4 weeks, then you would be counted as a discouraged worker, and you get counted as outside the labor force. Notice that to the extent that that would happen, the measured unemployment rate would be lower than it actually is. It's been estimated that if we said actively seeking means something in the last 8 weeks rather than the last 4 weeks, that the unemployment rate would be tenths of a percentage point higher. So rather than 6.2, we'd be looking at a number like 6.5 or 6.6. So this is the way the adult population looked in 2013. Notice not in the labor force is more than a third of the adult population. Almost 60% are employed, and about 8% were unemployed. So our definition of the civilian labor force, then, is everybody that has a job and everybody who's officially unemployed. And once we have the labor force, we can look at a number of ratios. The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. But we also have something called the labor force participation rate, which is the size of the labor force relative to the size of the adult population. And then finally, since the unemployment rate is focusing on the negative, those that don't have jobs, we also calculate the employment ratio, which looks at the number of people who do have jobs relative to the size of the population. So this is the official unemployment rate. The average here is a little bit higher than where I drew it, but it's just under 6% for that entire time period. So right now we're sitting here at 6.2%. So it looks like we're not too far away from our long-term average. So looking at this, one might argue that the labor market is almost back to its average performance over the last 65 years. This is the civilian labor force participation rate. What is the size of the labor force relative to the size of the adult population? And what you can see is starting in the late 60s, early 70s, we saw a pretty steady increase during that period of time. This reflects two phenomena. One is the maturation of the baby boom generation. Remember, the baby boom generation were those people that were born between 1946 and 1964. There were 75 million people in that age category. So if you think about 1946, add 20 years, 1966, the leading edge of the baby boom generation is now coming out of high school, coming out of college, coming into the workforce. And they were coming into the workforce in very large numbers for a 20-year period, or almost a 20-year period. Right? So that accounts for the fact that young people have higher labor force participation rates than older people do. We saw this rise. It's also part and parcel that the generation that was retiring was much smaller than the generation coming into the labor force. The second major factor that was going on here was not only was the baby boom generation coming into the labor force, but women's labor force participation rates started to rise significantly. So we have both a lot of baby boomers and many more women coming into the labor force during that period of time. Now, you can also see that in the last couple of years, we've seen this decline here before the recession started, partly reflecting the aging of the baby boom generation in the early retirements that were taking place, and then a sharp decline since then, of which about half is estimated to be because of aging baby boomers. So just give you some numbers. Every day, a baby boomer turns 62, 65, or 66, pick your year, it doesn't matter. 10,000 baby boomers every day, 365 days a year for the next 20 years. Baby boomers are going to age. And so it's going to be hard to get the labor force participation rate to move back up when you have this big demographic bulge moving out of the labor force. And finally, we've got that civilian employment population ratio. Right? So this is employment as a share of the adult population. Again, you can see that we had this long upward trend. Remember, employment is going to move up and down with the business cycle, so we get a lot more volatility here than we do in the participation rate. But this looks sort of like the participation rate, and you've got this huge decline here. And not much of an improvement out at the other end. So in fact, if we look at where we are now, we're talking about kind of back where we were in the early 1980s in terms of the number of adults that actually have jobs. So notice that this diagram, and the unemployment rate diagram, will give you different conclusions about the current conditions of the labor market. Right? The unemployment rate says, gosh, we're almost back to normal. We're almost back to that long-run average. The employment population ratio would say, whoa, we're way below where we've been for the last couple of decades. Is the labor market almost normal or still far away from it? This, by the way, is a debate that's going on inside the Federal Reserve today. How soon should they raise interest rates? What does the labor market look like? Okay. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about interest rates. So an interest rate can be thought of as either the cost of borrowing money or the return from lending money. Right? Borrowing and lending costs. We're not going to worry about what those differences are, particularly. It turns out that there are many different interest rates, and they differ primarily in these three categories: maturity, liquidity, and credit risk. Maturity simply means if you borrow money, how soon do you have to pay it back? In the United States, loans can go from overnight, you borrow it today, you pay it back tomorrow, out to about 30 or 40 years. There's not a lot that's out beyond 40 years. Right? But most mortgages, you're borrowing money for a 30-year time frame. Right? In some countries, the UK, for instance, they have a maturity. Some things that the United Kingdom government has borrowed, they never have to pay you back. That is, they're just going to make interest payments forever, but you're never going to get your principal back. In fact, they borrowed money like that 150 years ago, and they're still making interest payments on them. But you'll never get your money back. It's called a perpetuity or a console. But we don't see those in the United States. At least I'm not aware of any in the United States. Okay, so that's maturity. As you might expect, the longer you have to wait to get your money back, the higher the interest rate you want to charge. Okay, the second is liquidity. Liquidity really talks about how easy is it to buy or sell the piece of paper that says somebody owes you money. If you thought about the U.S. government, really easy to do. There's a very deep and liquid market. Everybody knows about the U.S. government, what their debt looks like, blah, blah, blah. So it's very easy to buy and sell U.S. government securities. But suppose that you had borrowed money from Professor Stephen Wood, LLC, Limited Liability Corporation, and now you say, I don't really want to own that piece of paper that says Professor Wood owes me $10,000. I want to sell it to somebody else. Think that'd be easy? Hard? Easier than the government? Harder to sell than government debt. Probably a whole lot harder, right? I mean, lots of people don't know who I am. They don't know Stephen Wood, LLC. They don't know anything about me, right? There's not much of my debt out there. Liquidity wouldn't be very great. The less liquidity there is, the higher the interest rate to compensate for the lack of liquidity. And finally, credit risk. What is the probability that you're not going to get your money back? Right? For the U.S. government, credit risk is very low. It's not zero, but it's very low, right? Stephen Wood, LLC, credit risk might be definitely not as good as the government's. Right? The greater the probability of default or not getting your money back, the higher the interest rate you want to charge. So the longer the maturity, the less liquid, and the greater the credit risk or default risk, the higher the interest rate will be. Now, this chart shows 4 different interest rates. The blue line is the federal funds rate, which is an overnight interest rate. I also have a 10-year U.S. Treasury bond rate, a 30-year mortgage rate and a approximately 7-year corporate BAA rate. Right? What do you notice about all these interest rates? They have a tendency to move up and down together. Right? They get a little squiggles here and there, but we move up together, we move down together. So just like we saw with inflation, just like we saw with GDP, GMP, and national income, we don't really need to think about what interest rate we're using. When we do, I'll be very specific about what that means. But for our purposes, for most of the course, we're only going to talk about the interest rate without necessarily identifying exactly what it is. Okay, and finally, let's talk about nominal versus real. Remember, I told you I was going to pound this into your head. Nominal includes the effects of any inflation. Real abstracts from those effects. So nominal interest rates are most of what we see in the United States the vast majority of the time. So you go into the bank to borrow money, that's a nominal interest rate. The interest rate on your credit card is a nominal interest rate. Okay? A real interest rate recognizes that inflation erodes the value of your principal over time. Since what you would like when you make a loan, you are deferring consumption today to enjoy consumption in the future. Well, in the future, you would like to be able to enjoy at least as much consumption as you could buy today, which means the purchasing power of your principal needs to increase. In order for that to happen, the real interest rate, again, abstracting from inflation, must be positive. We have two ways of calculating real interest rates, an ex post interest rate, which uses actual inflation. So we can only do this after the fact. The better one is an ex ante inflation rate, which is dependent upon expected inflation. The problem with expected inflation, it's really hard to measure exactly what those expectations are. So this chart just shows a nominal interest rate in blue and a real interest rate in orange. The only two things that I'll point out is nominal interest rates never go below zero. Real interest rates can. The other thing, I said the only thing I'll point out, there is one other thing. The difference between these two is what? So what does this difference represent? Inflation, right? So that's inflation. Okay, real interest rates are important because they give us an incentive to borrow or an incentive to lend. When rates are low, we should be borrowing. Real interest rates are low, we should be borrowing. When real interest rates are high, we should be saving. And we'll talk about the Fisher equation on Thursday. Okay, have a good afternoon, what's left of it, and I'll see you on Thursday, where we'll talk about production functions.